Right, okay, sorry. Right, we'll move on to the next slide. Now, if you have a look at that 19th century map, which we saw at an exhibition at the British Library when there were maps, and my wife remarked, Poland's not there. Poland didn't exist for about 170 years. And so it's a country right in the center of Europe. It comes and goes and boundaries change. And if we go on to the next screen, there's a short little video showing you that. Right, next slide. And this shows the position at the World War II border changes, where basically Poland shifted to the left, as it were, took over some parts of Germany and lost all its borders, Kresy area, in the east. And that's where my parents come from, and many of the Poles that ended up in the UK after the Second World War. And can we move on to the next slide? And just give it a press. So you should see who these people are. I don't know if you're familiar with them. But most of them spent not a lot of time in Poland, because Poland's got a big diaspora. Polonia, over 20 million Poles, estimated at least, probably a lot more than that, live elsewhere. And on to the next slide. And that's Adam Mickiewicz. And again, he'd never spent any time in Krakow or Warsaw, and only spent a very, very short time in what is now known as Poland. National poet. Yeah, thank you. Next slide, yeah. And then we have the Munich Agreement. There was a lot of discussion between the UK, France, Germany, Russia, USSR as was then. A lot of alliances sought, but in the end, we had the Munich Agreement that we sort of know about, which apparently brought peace in our time. Next slide, please. And then came the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, and there was a secret protocol to partition Poland. The Russians then gained the advantage that without really going to war, they could gain half of Poland. The next slide, please. And in this slide, the two dictators meet. Hitler is saying the scum of the earth, I believe, and Stalin is saying the bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. Next slide, please. And as I said, it was considered that the Russian pact gave Hitler a free hand in Poland. Next slide. And so, as we know, the Germans invaded, and then the Russians invaded just a few weeks later. And next slide. And so, what a lot of people in the UK don't realise is that Poland, for those first few weeks, was the only country fighting, and fighting on two fronts, which is virtually impossible. And of course, the Poles were waiting for the British and the French to do something, but initially they were very much fighting on their own. Next slide, please. There was a government in exile formed. The government managed to escape and was based in London. Much of the army, a lot of the army managed to escape, mainly through Romania, and also some managed to make their way to France and fought there. Meanwhile, initially in the eastern part of the country, a lot of the Poles were quite confused because they thought that the Russians were coming to help them, to liberate them, and that certainly wasn't the case. Yes, certainly. Next slide, please. And in the eastern part of the country, the ethnic Poles there were considered traitors to the USSR and were deported to slave labor camps across Siberia and across the large gulags that were in the USSR. A lot of people see or know the photographs of people being deported in cattle trucks by the Germans, but exactly the same thing happened to the Poles. There was supposed to be a limit of about 20 or 20 to 25 in the cattle trucks, and families were supposed to be kept together, but because of those conflicting orders, quite often there were as many as 70 people in one carriage, and they travelled across the USSR for over a month in cold conditions, incredibly cramped. Anybody that died, the bodies were just thrown off the train, and sanitary conditions certainly, there was certainly no privacy. All there was a hole in the floor of the trucks. Next slide, please. And there are the concentration camp areas, and Poles were sent to slave labor camps in a lot of the inhospitable parts of the USSR. Next slide, please. And there's the sort of typical landscape. So pretty bleak, and everybody had to work. Next slide. During this time, of course, it wasn't known at that point, but the officers were rounded up into 3 separate camps and just went missing, and nobody knew where they were. But as you can see from this still from an Andrzej Wajda film, that's what happened to them. Next slide. And of course, then Germany attacked Russia, and there were the aims. And at that point, Stalin realized that he needed the help of the Poles, and there were a large number of Poles that could be in an army, but the Poles, generally speaking, wouldn't enlist to defend Russia. And so, next slide, please. And so a separate Polish army was formed under the overall command of the UK army, and General Anders, who was one of the prisoners who managed to escape being killed, was the commander. Next slide, please. And when they were getting the slide together, the army together, it was then noticed that a lot of the officers were missing. And this is Sikorski, who was the leader of the government in exile, actually handing Stalin a list of the missing officers. And if you click again, you'll see Stalin's response was, apparently they all escaped to Manchuria. Next slide. And the Germans eventually, when they took over that part of the USSR, discovered these mass graves in 1943. And next slide. And then the graves were exhumed again by the Russians in 1943. It was quite clear from the documents and newspapers that the officers had on them that they had been killed at the time when the Germans weren't there, but this was covered up by the Russians. And indeed, at the Nuremberg trials, they tried to indict the Germans for this crime. Next slide, please. That was typical of the sort of facilities that the Soviets provided. These are summer tents in winter conditions. Next slide. And this is a photograph of some children, but the adult males were also in not very good condition. And so it was realized that we had to get the Poles out of the USSR if there was any chance of having some sort of reasonably fit army. Next slide, please. And so they gradually made their way. Here you see a sign, 2 pictures of boats, incredibly crowded, again, very unsanitary conditions. Next slide. I think we missed a slide, but never mind. Eventually, can you go back one more? No, I think, oh, never mind. No, go forwards. Yeah. They ended up in camps in Africa and also in India. There was a camp in India that had 10,000 occupants. Next slide. And here are the list, and I dare say it's not exhaustive, of all the contributions that the Poles made to the army effort, and also in particular notice first to fight. The Poles were fighting from the very first day and for the first few weeks on their own until the very end. And in fact, the Polish armed forces were the fourth largest after the Soviet Union, United States, and the British Army. Next slide, please. Monte Cassino is a very Poles fought in North Africa, and in Monte Cassino in particular, and that's my father in the. In fact, he's a third along on the bottom row there. Next slide. And again, this shows the numbers involved and the percentages. Of course, we hear quite a lot about the losses of Russia and other countries, but when you think of it in terms of depending on the population, that's the Polish losses were, incredibly high. Next slide, please. And so, eventually, after the war, as we know, the Russians, in effect, took over the sphere of influence, either in Poland and various other countries where there were so-called free elections. I haven't got time to go into them now, but bearing in mind the way the Poles had been treated, they were certainly not really willing to go back, although they were encouraged to do so by the Bevin government. And so several hundred resettlement camps were set up. Some of them, well, all of them were ex-military establishments. And the very top one, where you see the barbed wire still, which is Ilford Park Polish Home, that's the new sign for it there on the left. But the barbed wire was there in all the time that I was there. Not quite sure whether it was to keep us in or the outsiders out. And it was known as Stover then. And the bottom is again typical of the sort of army type feel to it. Next slide, please. Most of the camps were very temporary constructions, and they were these metal barrel huts, beczki. They were heated with a very small stove, if you were lucky, concrete floors or lino if you were particularly lucky. In those beczki, quite often there would be two families in them. Next slide. This here is just shows about half, and you can see at the bottom how big this camp was. This was Ilford Park, the camp in Stover where I was born. In the early stages, there were about 600 people there with large numbers of families, but over time, obviously, that dwindled. And we didn't have many beczki, but those windows you can see, that would be the size of a room that quite often, a family, in my case, that was 3 of us, would be just in one room. Next slide, please. A lot of cultural and religious life continued. There were the usual processions and First Holy Communion and so on. And at the bottom there, you can see there was some sort of performance. Next slide. And that was the canteen. I'll move on quite quickly now. Next slide. And so there was a shop, a co-op shop, and that's me. And next slide. Next slide. And the Poles like their rural life. Beyond the woods, you can see in the photograph on the left, there were lots of plots where various people kept chickens. And in contrast, that's some of my family that were moved to the west and that was near Wrocław in 1953. Next slide, please. And if we just play the video, and at that point.
But most of the children know that their future lies in Devon and beyond. But do they think of themselves as English or Polish?
Well, you see, they have their parents here, and they started from the youth or from their childhood, and the very moment they finish school, we are pushing them out.
Are they going to be Polish or English?
Oh, English. They are English born, and they will be English. Of course, they know that they are of English or Polish origin, but they are English citizens, you see. If you ask them who they are, they will say, well, I'm a Pole, but I'm a British citizen, and they are loyal to both countries.
Does this make difficulties for them in
Not
adjusting?
at all. Not at all. They are really at home here.
But is it really as simple as all that? The children are not quite so sure, and living in 2 different worlds seems to have left its mark.
Polish.
Why?
Well, because I've been brought up here, and well, my parents are Polish, so I look upon myself as Polish.
But aren't you really going to be English?
I hope not.
Why not?
Well, you're different, and I've brought up in sort of Polish, environment, so I consider myself to be Polish.
I go to an English school where there's some Polish children as well, and English. And I think of myself as Polish.
I think of myself as being Polish.
Why?
Well, I'm in amongst Polish people all the time. The only time I see English people is outside the camp, going to town or somewhere, or school. So naturally, I think of myself as Polish.
I feel English. When I stay at home, I feel Polish.
You really feel English at school?
Yeah,
Well, are you English or Polish?
Polish.
Well, I'm always with English people, and I'm speaking more English in a way during school time, because I go to school, from 9 o'clock till 4, so it's mostly English, really. And you tend to forget, Polish.
Next slide, and then at that point I'll finish. What would be interesting to know is that the more recent Poles coming to this country, I understand that quite a number of their children in a very short time prefer to speak English rather than Polish. But it would be interesting to interview some of them and see what they think. The rest of the slides are just references and things, so I don't want to take up any more time. We can just whiz through them, because anybody seeing them on video can just pause it. Thank you. Sorry I've taken up a bit too much time.
Thank you, Roman. Thank you so much.